Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm sorry for the late start for those of you who are joining on the live Zoom link. I had a little bit of trouble getting things set up this morning, so I do apologize for that. I'm running a few minutes late. So I want to go ahead and just to lay out for you where we stand in terms of covering course content through the remainder of the term. And we're getting very close. Now springtime is here, and so the semester is almost over. So we're going to talk today about Chapter 15. We've already begun talking a little bit about money and the financial markets. And we sort of stopped at a pretty good place, I think, last Wednesday, in the sense that we talked about money, we talked about the bond market. In other words, I think we gave a pretty good foundation for what really is sort of the main event with regard to this idea of policy. And that is, we're going to talk about monetary policy today. We'll define what that is, and we'll define who the actor is, the Federal Reserve. And I know what is interesting about this discussion about the Federal Reserve is that we've been talking about the Federal Reserve again and again and again in this course without really defining who they are, other than the fact that fairly early on in the course we defined them as one of the main actors when it came to government policy, attempting to stabilize the economy in terms of employment and price level. And so we'll talk much more about them today. And then when we come back on Thursday, which will be the last, regular class session, I guess you could say, we're going to talk about fiscal policy, which is the other element of government policy. And again, in macro, whenever we use the term policy, we're almost always talking about government policy, because when we talk about policy trying to manage the broad overall macro economy, there's really only one actor that has the capability of dealing with it, and that's government. So in fact, no individual state government really has that capability. Even our very largest state, California, they can make decisions for California, but they don't extend really beyond the borders of that state. So it's got to be the national government that does this. And so, and again, I know that the perspective that we take in this course is out of the US economy. And I realize that sometimes misses the point, because any macro course anywhere could focus on any domestic economy, whether it's Denmark or Finland or Japan or whatever. But since I suspect we all have some connection, at least, to the United States, that we'll talk about the US system here, which is pretty representative of how other systems operate. Maybe not identically, but in terms of modern economies, our system tends to be pretty much replicated elsewhere. Okay, so today we'll do that. On the 7th, we'll talk about fiscal policy. Next week, whatever we don't have done here, we'll pick up and finish up for the Tuesday class session. The majority of that session, I think we'd like to spend time reviewing for the 4th exam. And the 4th exam will be held from the end of class session on Thursday. It'll be available in Brightspace, same format as before, same number of questions, same time frame, and the same opportunity to take the exam. You can take it in class or at one of the campuses, or, which is I suspect what you're all going to want to do, is to take it on Brightspace, which will be available through the end of the evening on Sunday. And I believe that date is correct. I believe that's the 17th. So, and then the final week is the very last opportunity. It's the last go around. It's a 15-week semester. So on that Tuesday, we'll first talk about the final exam, and we'll get more to that as we get a little bit closer. I like to not skip too far ahead when it comes to exams. And we'll talk about what to expect. And the final exam will be slightly different. The format will be mostly the same. The questions will differ a bit, and the time frame will differ a bit. But we'll talk about that as we get closer to that time. Okay, so that's where we're sort of heading. Also, I got sort of late going, right? For whatever reason, I think I don't know. We just didn't get things going here. I have no excuse. We just didn't get going quickly enough. So I did not email out the PowerPoint slides for this week yet. I'll do that right after class. So obviously, for those of you watching the video link, it makes probably no difference to you. But for those of you who are on the live link, it's not available. I apologize. I'm going to head to my office right after class. I promise. And I will email it to the class, and so you'll have it. It is unorthodox. I'm sort of out of my element when it comes to emailing things on a routine basis that are regular class materials. But for whatever reason, I think we need to really have a hard look at Brightspace over the summer to find out why it's duplicating some of this material. I don't know why it's doing that. And my conversations with distance learning last semester, when it first popped up, didn't really yield anything because they didn't know either. So I don't know. And it could be that I'm just going to have to do something completely different. But for right now, we'll just go with what we've got. It's probably just easier to email it to everyone so that you've got it. Unfortunately, I just did not get it to you in time today. So my apologies for that. Okay. All right. So are there questions for me about anything that we talked about last week or anytime really with regard, excuse me, to where we are with regard to this discussion of money and banking? And we did cover a lot of ground last week in terms of talking about the monetary system, and we're going to be definitely covering that today and talking in more details about how it actually works. And we did talk a bit about money creation as well last time, so I think we got a pretty good foundation for where we're going. What we want to do today is sort of segue then into chapter 15, which deals with the Federal Reserve and its role as in monetary policy. So, but I want to step back here just a bit, and this ink is not very good. Let me get a different marker here. I want to step back here just a bit in order to talk about monetary policy in terms of sort of where it fits into the overall scheme of macroeconomic management. And this sort of fits under the rubric of what we would call stabilization policy. And again, as I've said numerous times now, the term policy really refers to government policy, but let's be more specific when it comes to stabilization, because this really is the major objective of macro policy. And it really is this: the definition of stabilization policy is, well, you can frame it in different ways, but it's basically government efforts to achieve non-inflationary full employment. Non-inflationary full employment is essentially what the goal is of macro policy. So, and this sort of modifier is non-inflationary, excuse me, is really important because at the moment we've got definitely inflationary conditions, no question about it. And I need not convince anybody here, I don't think, that we have inflationary conditions, general rises in overall price levels. And so we may be at full employment. And in fact, not only are we probably at full employment, we're probably a bit beyond full employment. We've probably overshot the mark. And the evidence for that is the fact that if economists believe that the full employment rate of unemployment, which I know is a mouthful, excuse me, the full employment rate of unemployment, or what some people call the natural rate of unemployment, I think your text generally refers to it as the natural rate of unemployment. That is the rate of unemployment which, the word is natural because it's going to naturally occur, hence the term, that you're going to have a combination of frictional and structural unemployment. That is, you're always going to have people laid off for various reasons, people being terminated for various reasons, people leaving their jobs voluntarily to move or to find some other work, or they've been structurally dislocated because of firms closing up and moving overseas or replacing labor with technology. All of those things are both natural. What is not natural is cyclical unemployment. To the extent that there is cyclical unemployment, it would create more unemployment than what would naturally exist. And I want to talk a bit about this nature, the nature then of stabilization and how it might actually work, particularly in the context of monetary policy. And then we'll sort of fill in the blanks with fiscal policy. But before we do that, though, I will come back to that. But I want to sort of lay out who the two actor groups are here. And I'll first, and actually, let me put it in chapter order. The chapter order is a little bit different than what we see most textbooks. Usually, we start with fiscal policy, then move to monetary policy. For whatever reason, I don't know why it's the case here. It doesn't really matter. But monetary policy is one of those forms of stabilization policy, and it's conducted by unelected officials. Unelected officials. This has been the source of some controversy, and we'll talk about that here in a second. The idea, excuse me, I'm still fighting with these allergies here. The idea that people who conduct monetary policy are not elected by the public at large. They're essentially appointed, and even though they're appointed and eventually approved by elected officials, once in office, they really don't have accountability to the general public. This has been a source of some controversy over the years. I will say, though, however, that the Federal Reserve has tried to sort of acknowledge this and has gone out of its way to be very transparent as to what it's doing. I mean, the interest rate increase that we had about 2 weeks ago was far from a surprise. We had been knowing about it for months and months and months. That, in fact, we knew when it was going to happen and how much it was going to be. The only thing we didn't really know is what the Fed anticipated in terms of an end point for what they expected, not promised, but expected to be the end point of this policy to raise interest rates to try to slow the economy down, to try to bring prices down. And they said about 11 more interest rate increases. So if you're going to refinance your house, I would probably think about doing that sooner rather than later, even though we've already seen mortgage rates move in reaction to that. So monetary policy is the first. We'll talk about this today. And the fiscal policy is the second. We'll get to that on Thursday. Fiscal policy is entirely conducted by elected officials. In other words, we're talking about Congress and the president. Okay, and again, even though states and even localities have their own fiscal policies in terms of budgets and taxation, that's not what we're talking about in terms of stabilization. Even though states will say, well, we're trying to work on maybe having tax incentives for hiring of maybe the disabled, for instance. And so therefore, that's a way to improve employment. Okay, that's true. That may be a good program. It's a good social program, perhaps. But it's really not intended to deal with the broader macro economy. That is maybe a program to help a certain segment of the population. It's probably not going to bring about wholesale changes throughout even an entire state economy. So we really can't say that efforts on the part of state governments in taxation and government spending programs is really intended as stabilization. It may be intended to improve employment. It may be intended to try to deal with particular problems in the labor market, which is very often a role played, but it's not really part of the broader national stabilization policy. Okay, so non-inflationary full employment is the goal. So let's talk about this. We've talked a bit about this before, but I think it's particularly important now when we talk about policy and the direction that policy is moving, in order for us to understand where things are looking at various points, and therefore being able to decide what to do about it. And then we're going to do a full-fledged discussion about the Federal Reserve, how they're structured, what they're up to. So anyway, so let's just take an axis, and that's the y-axis, and that's it's not the y-axis like we see in mathematics. We're talking about the GDP axis that we've been dealing with in this macro model we've been creating, going back to the first discussion of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And so if we've got a condition where we've got full employment GDP here, or the so-called natural rate of unemployment, that is the rate of unemployment that exists, that achieves the GDP. Remember, unemployment, particularly labor unemployment, is expressed as a percentage of the labor force, but GDP is always expressed as a dollar figure. So it's the dollar figure of output and income, which corresponds to a natural rate of unemployment, which is not set in stone, but it's thought to be around 4 to 5%. So let's split it in the middle and call it 4.5%. Which, by the way, that itself is not a long-term stable prospect, because years ago, I can remember when economists believed that maybe 7% was considered full employment. And I think one of the explanations for why that's come down so significantly in terms of our expectations is the fact that we have been able to operate in a non-inflationary environment below 7% unemployment for quite some time. And a lot of the frictional unemployment tends to be better able to be dealt with primarily through the internet. I mean, the old way of looking for a job, particularly for those who had to create resumes, even those who fill out paper applications, was horribly inefficient. And I can recall even when I first graduated from college, even graduate school, mailing a resume, having it sit somewhere while someone's on vacation, nobody looks at it, somebody digs it up, and then suddenly you get a call 3 months later and you've already gotten a job. Maybe it's not the job you wanted, but finally somebody gets to you, or you fill out a paper application. Today, it's much more efficient. So if you're frictionally or structurally unemployed, even if the economy is not doing well, at least you're probably going to get reviewed fairly quickly, because a lot of the software and the screening programs, will pick up keywords of what your skills are: welder, pipe fitter, whatever. Boom, it'll start to fit you together by picking up on keywords, which is an efficiency that we lacked before that. So I think that's one reason why the natural rate has come down, is because people are unemployed for shorter periods generally. Now, I know this pandemic sort of violates that broader, longer term view. And that's true. And the fact that the unemployment benefits were raised and extended and all that may have created a little bit of incentive for people to maybe not be in quite such a hurry to get back to work. There's probably some evidence of that. I don't think that's a gigantic portion of the labor force, but it's not zero. I'm reasonably sure of that. That, if you couple that with the stimulus checks, the advanced child tax credit, and all the paycheck protection program, I think this has created sort of a disincentive, and I think it's why we probably have overshot the mark. But let me come back to that overshooting aspect here in a minute. What if the actual GDP is less than full employment GDP? Then the difference between those really represents what we call an output gap. You know, I believe we've talked about this term before, but we're going to talk about it more now in terms of where things are at various points in terms of is actual greater or less than full employment. So an output gap is any kind of difference where actual GDP is not equivalent to full employment GDP. And when I say not equal to, it's got to be close. If it's close, then that's probably close enough, right? In a macro economy, you're probably not going to get two variables to exactly equal one another. The only exception being that we make equivalent the income and expenditures approach from GDP, mostly because they have to equal. It doesn't make sense if they can't. And if they're not equaling, it's a math error, it's a measurement error. So if it's close enough, we say that we're full employment. If it's not equal, or if it's not close enough at all, we say that there's an output gap. In the case in which actual GDP is less than full employment GDP, we call that a recessionary gap. We call that a recessionary gap. And the policy response then would be, a recessionary gap. The policy response then would be to stimulate the economy. So expansionary policy is needed. Whether it's fiscal or monetary or some combination, expansionary policy is needed. And when I say it's needed, and that assumes, I guess, that you believe that GDP should be raised, and the government's got a role to play. Now, remember, we've talked about in class the differences between the Keynesian sort of worldview that was very activist in nature, particularly in terms of stimulating aggregate demand, particularly to move an economy from some suboptimal place where there's unemployment and recession to something greater in terms of full employment and greater output income, where the assumption is that only government can do the job. There is, again, the neoclassical view that says that, wait a minute, not so fast, that the assumption is that the economy is generally at or near full employment, and that if it's out of whack, it sort of gets itself back in whack, if you like, by doing it on its own. That is, if there's unemployment happening, workers will take lower wages, or they'll find other jobs, or they'll move to where the jobs are. Keep in mind that there are occasions in which there's unemployment, but the unemployment is concentrated in areas where there really aren't jobs available, and the jobs are elsewhere. And so if people wanted to take advantage of those opportunities, they would have to move. And that's easier said than done. I realize not everyone is in a position to pack up their family and get a U-Haul and move, but nonetheless, those are, but I will say though that people are more willing to do that now than in previous generations, for sure. I know my parents' generation was very reluctant to do that. And although in my dad's case, he was in the Army for a lot of years and traveled around and probably just didn't want to move again, that it would be his case. But you get the idea that an expansionary policy assumes that the policy is needed and that we believe the government's got a role to play, which I think is really sort of the mainstream macro view when it comes to policy. Frankly, I think the classical view that says government should do nothing is a little bit overly theoretical and makes a lot of assumptions that an economy is going to self-correct when it may or may not. The Great Depression, which is when Keynes himself was doing the writing, saw the economy stuck below full employment for year after year after year. And he basically said, look, if the economy was going to self-correct, we're still waiting. Hasn't happened. Government stimulus was needed. And that's what expansionary policy is all about, stimulus. We're going to be talking about that today with regard to monetary policy. And if we are not done with that, we'll carry it over into Thursday. And the fiscal policy piece will go a little bit quicker, but we should be in pretty good shape in order to wrap up all that we wanted to cover in the class. Okay. Now, what if we reverse the condition here and said, and by the way, one of the things I should tell you is this: let's say the output gap is, let's say the output gap in this case, it's a recessionary gap is $500 billion, okay, which is pretty small in terms of our economy, but let's say it's 500 billion. That's the difference between here and here, okay? And let's say the multiplier, remember what the multiplier is? It's that factor which takes some sort of change in spending and multiplies it toward a greater impact on GDP. So it's the change in Y that results from initial change in aggregate demand, right? And let's say that in this case it's 4, right? Then you only need to go $125 billion, which is 500 divided by 4, right? So in other words, if you take the multiplier times the change in aggregate demand, change in aggregate demand here, times the change in aggregate demand, you should arrive at the 500 billion, which is the change in Y, right? So, well, we know the multiplier is 5 times the change in aggregate demand. Divide both sides by 5 here. Did I say, oh, it's 4, it's not 5, it's 4, I'm sorry. I was gonna say, I didn't think it was that. So 500 billion, divide both sides by 4, and you get the change in aggregate demand that's needed is 125 billion. That's how the multiplier works. It ripples through the economy. So the initial stimulus is only 125 billion, and then it works through the multiplier. And I realized that in the text, the online text, it didn't really get that much into the multiplier. I would have preferred that we have a greater discussion of how the multiplier works, because there are lots and lots of multipliers in economics, and we're going to see one with regard to the monetary multiplier here shortly. It's just another form of multiplier. And what a multiplier really is, and I'll just come back to what the definition was, it's some expansion of the total effect of some change in policy, particularly on the broader economy. Because why? Because if there's a change in spending, and how do we measure change in aggregate demand by a change in spending, right? Remember, the elements of spending are consumption, investment, government spending, and the changes in net exports. So if there's a change in, let's say, government spending, right, through the expansionary government policy, and the government expands spending by $125 billion, then people's spending becomes someone else's income. This is what the purpose of the stimulus checks were all about during the pandemic, was that our economy was suboptimally performing. We were operating below full employment, at least in the beginning of that. So the government was dropping money on people so that they would spend it, which they did. But my spending becomes your income becomes my spending. So I spend it. And then there's unanticipated receipt of income. That means that a business is going to restock inventory, and makers of goods are going to produce more inventory. All along that value chain, all along the production value, where workers are being employed, they themselves are spending more. And so as a result, it ripples out from some additional change, depending upon what the value of the multiplier is. And 4 may be a little bit high, 5 is definitely high, I think. But it's just an example of how that works. That is, government does not need to go all the way from 0 to 60 in 2.8 seconds. It just has to step on the gas a little bit, just to get a little bit of a kickstart in order for the private economy to go the whole way. And this is really what the Keynesian theory was all about, was this idea of just getting government to give a little juice to the economy. The Keynes himself said, look, the private economy can do it, they just need a little bit of a jump start. And that's all that really was needed. And I know that his critics sort of derided him as being some proto-socialist who really wanted the government to take over everything. And I know there are those who think that whatever government does, it's some conspiracy to take over everything. And that's not what he was advocating. And this idea that John Maynard Keynes, who was a billionaire stock trader and currency speculator and manager of an insurance company, that said he was somehow some sort of left-wing communist, is completely absurd anyway. So, but there are those who will criticize pretty much anybody for anything. So you kind of get that idea that it does work in both directions. Okay. All right. That's a gap in that direction. What about a gap in the other direction? Let's just sort of reverse it. And let's say that we have a condition where it's just the opposite, where we have actual GDP out here and we have full employment GDP right here. Okay. So full employment GDP is here. In other words, we've got now a gap in the other direction. We've got a condition where now we've got what's called an inflationary gap. And by the way, I think there's a lot of evidence for the fact that we have an inflationary situation because actual GDP is probably greater than full employment GDP. How do we know that? I think we don't know that, but I think we suspect it because, again, if we consider the rate of unemployment as full employment as being, let's say, 4.5%, we're at 3.8% right now. We have a very low unemployment rate. And what do we have as a result of that? We have inflationary conditions, which is why the government, and primarily through monetary policy, is seeking to sort of dial this down in order to bring some of the spending down. And we will see that it's not always the case that monetary policy and fiscal policy will work together. I suspect that fiscal policy under the Biden administration is going to seek to expand, while monetary policy under the Federal Reserve is probably going to want to contract. It's going to go the other direction. And so whenever there's an inflationary gap, we're talking about a contractionary policy is needed. And so we're going to talk about it both from fiscal and monetary standpoints. And by the way, the same multiplier works in the same direction. It's $500 billion. It's now going to be $125 billion in the other direction. And then let the private economy do its thing. The multiplier works in both directions. It works in both directions. And so as a result of this, I think there's a lot of evidence for the fact that we are operating beyond full employment. I mean, and don't even take my word for it. Just look around. Just go to Walmart or Walgreens or restaurants or wherever. Invariably, there are help wanted signs. Help wanted everywhere. If you can't get a job right now, there's something that's not working right because most people who really want a job can probably find it. It may not be the exact job you want in the right place, the right hours, the right pay, whatever. But there are jobs out there, and to the point where I think that this is indicative. The last time I saw this many job openings was probably the late 90s, and wage increases to match that. I think I mentioned in class that if you go to Walmart, I know the one I go to has a table right as you walk in that's got like a listing of job openings and the wages, and some of them are $15 per hour, which is, if it's full time, that's $31,000 a year with benefits. That's not rap star wages, but it's pretty good wages for a job that doesn't really require any sort of experience or background, and that's from a historical standpoint, that's a pretty good starting wage. It really is. And if there are two people in the household who are both doing that, that translates to over $60,000 per year, and that is above the average income right now for households in the economy. It's close to average, but it's a little bit above. So that's probably, if you're going to want to get a job now, just like if you're going to want to refinance, you probably ought to do that fairly quickly. I suspect, and it's not just my crystal ball prognostication, which I think you ought to be careful about those sorts of talking heads on TV who can tell you exactly what's going to happen. I can tell you what I think is going to happen based upon experience, and that is every time since the Great Depression, which goes back almost 100 years, every time the Federal Reserve has raised interest rates, it's ended in a recession, which means higher unemployment. And I don't think it's going to be this year. I think sometime next year we fall into a recession, and I think it's practically inevitable. And I think we're at the peak of a business cycle right now. Remember peaks and troughs and all that. I think we're at the peak, and I think it's going to be brought down, mostly through policy. And frankly, if anything, the government, particularly the monetary authorities, are probably behind the curve. I've been saying this since the beginning of class back in January that I think the Federal Reserve is behind the curve, and I'm not alone. It's not that I've got the only crystal ball. A lot of people in the economics profession has been saying that we need to dial things down because inflation is running crazy. And the Federal Reserve itself said that, okay, we were a little bit wrong. When we said it was going to be temporary, it was going to go away. It's all due to supply kinks in the supply chain because of COVID. Well, that's probably not so much what's going on. Probably now it's the economy's overheated. So that's, I think, where we're going. So these are the gaps that are being dealt with. And this is what is being sought to be managed to achieve the ultimate goal of national government policy macroeconomically to achieve non-inflationary full employment. The two forms are monetary and fiscal policy. We're going to talk about monetary policy as the first. And so let's talk a bit about the actor. The actor group here is our Federal Reserve System. Finally, we're going to talk about the Federal Reserve. Hallelujah, right? Because we've been talking about them now for several weeks intermittently, but it's almost impossible not to, because of the gigantic, really outsized role that they play in the economy. It really is an important one. So let's talk about the Federal Reserve and what it's all about. So if you go back to last week's slide package, week 12, we discussed the Federal Reserve System. The one and all, in fact, it's probably the case that what I'll be emailing you today, we're not even going to get to today. So it's, if you don't have it, those of you on the live feed, you're probably not going to lose anything anyway. So, but I will give that to you. It's going to deal mostly with fiscal policy. But let's talk about monetary policy, chapter 15. Then on Thursday, we'll talk about chapter 17. What is the Federal Reserve System? It's considered our nation's central bank. That is, it's a government-owned bank. Created in 1913 in the wake of a very severe banking crisis. There's a little bit of history here. This was not the first attempt to start something like a central bank, based upon something like the Bank of England, which has been around for hundreds of years and has been relatively successful at stabilizing at least the monetary and credit conditions in Britain. The United States had two different attempts to try to start something like it. One was called the First Bank of the United States back in the early 1800s. It had a 20-year charter given to it by Congress. At the end of 20 years, Congress decided not to renew it. And whatever kind of stability it did provide saw additional chaos once it was dissolved. And the second effort to bring back something like it was called, naturally, the Second Bank of the United States, which had also a 20-year charter, which was also not renewed, primarily because President Jackson, Andrew Jackson, had some weird fixation on paper money and banking in general. It's interesting to talk about Andrew Jackson because he's on the $20 bill. There have been efforts to get him off the $20 bill because he probably wouldn't want to be on it were he alive anyway, because he was so anti-money, anti-banking, anti-finance. And yet this is a very wealthy man. And it's not really clear what his hang-ups were. A lot of historians have speculated that he was probably, by the time he was president, he was probably mentally ill. And therefore, he was making some really strange and really crazy decisions, frankly. Moving entire populations of Native Americans, just picking them up and forcing them to move. Really not a very good chapter in US history. And that was all Andrew Jackson's doing. This was also a president who survived an assassination attempt and himself chased the assassin down the street in Washington, DC. So this was a person who's not probably dealing with a full stack, and that's unfortunate. I'm not a psychologist. I can't diagnose anybody. I certainly can't do it in hindsight. Nobody can. But Andrew Jackson made a lot of strange decisions. Among those was to get rid of that system. And we had lots and lots of financial and economic chaos in the 1800s as a result of that, because he had such a powerful role in the Democratic Party, which really ruled American politics throughout the first 2/3 of the 19th century. And as a result of that, we had periodic depressions in the 1830s, and the 1850s, 1870s, 1890s. We're not talking about periodic recessions. We're talking about full-blown depressions, which are defined as prolonged, deeper and longer downturns in the economy, often because of some structural malady that's going on, oftentimes dealing with finance and the fact that the sound financial system wasn't put in place. By the way, it was Abraham Lincoln, who we think of as almost exclusively being about the Civil War, and that whole era actually started the era of bank regulation, which we didn't spend that much time talking about just because in the interest of time, but that's where some stability was sort of brought to bear on the banking system, which frankly needed regulation because it was an out of control. Anybody can start a bank, and anybody can print their own money. That's a recipe for chaos, no question about it. So anyway, Andrew Jackson probably did not help the cause very much, unfortunately, because of his outsized role. It really took a while. It took until a really major banking crisis of 1907 happened for the federal government to finally get its act together and create a modern central bank, which today is absolutely essential to running a modern economy. No question, the U.S. was late to the party. And I'm sort of picking on Andrew Jackson, but it really, I think, restrained progress in American economic development and monetary development because of this just absolutely paranoid view of banks and bankers. And some of that was deserved. I think that's probably true. And I'm not defending bankers because I used to be on it. I am among the critics of the industry that I think it walks itself into trouble every 20 or 30 years. So I do not hold back on that. I'm simply saying from a macro perspective that we were late to the party. I mean, it's only been just about 100 years that we've had a central bank. And frankly, it was done mostly because we had a change in government administration. One of the first things that Woodrow Wilson did was sign the National Bank Act. And also, the banking crisis of 1907 was resolved by private individuals. We've been talking endlessly in this class about policy being a function of government because only government could do it. Well, the 1907 banking crisis was resolved by J.P. Morgan almost single-handedly, personally. Not J.P. Morgan, the firm which exists today, still to this day that I used to work for, but J.P. Morgan, the guy, the man who basically got New York bankers, locked them in a room in his house and said, nobody leaves until we restructure the banking system. Well, that's clearly not a very democratic situation, no question about it. So obviously we can't let private individuals dictate policy for the entire economy. So it was started. That's a little bit of history as to the Federal Reserve. And I know there's been a lot of, mystery surrounding the Federal Reserve, a lot of conspiracy theory because they're unelected, they act secretly in all this. And I think that a lot of it's overblown. In fact, the Federal Reserve has tried to be as transparent as possible. And I know there have been calls for the Federal Reserve to be audited. I know we had some politicians in Washington for years. A guy named Ron Paul, who was a former presidential candidate, he called year after year for the Federal Reserve to be audited. The Federal Reserve said, we are audited. We are audited. And it's almost like saying to somebody, you need to paint your house. And they said, it's painted. Look over here, it's painted. I just painted it, right? Open your eyes, it's right there. And so the Federal Reserve eventually said, you know what? On their main page of the website, we are audited every year by KPMG, an independent auditor, worldwide auditing company. Here's the link to our audit. What more do you want? It's like, here is the audit. So there are people who just won't give up on the Federal Reserve. They just have this thing about it. And it's unlike any organization that I can think of in the government that has this, these feelings of conspiracy and what I suspect it's because they're unelected. But they're unelected for a reason. I think we'll get to that hopefully before we leave. And probably the mechanics of expansion and contractionary policy. I'll probably wait till Thursday. It's probably going to be better because I've got some setup to do for that. I got a number of graphs to do. Unfortunately, when I have a classroom full of people, I just use the whole board because it takes up a lot of space. I'm going to have to sort of set some of this up, and it's probably best that I do that. So I can't afford to get a late start on Thursday. So we'll get to that. So it was created in 1813 and result of that. It was set up as a both centralized and decentralized system where you've got a main headquarters in Washington, D.C., which is where the Federal Reserve Board of Governors is located, and 12 district banks around the country. And there's an interesting map in your text that shows where those districts are located all throughout the country. Albuquerque is within District 10, headquartered in Kansas City. And I believe District 10 includes most of Kansas. Well, it's Kansas City, Missouri, so part of Missouri, but also all of Kansas. I think part of Texas, I think all of Colorado, Oklahoma, and in the northern half of New Mexico. In fact, I think probably that Valencia County probably is in the Dallas Federal Reserve District 11. I think that's where it cuts off is Romeo County and sort of a line that runs across the state, sort of a jagged fashion to pick up counties. So that's where we are here. I bring that up only because for those of you who work in finance, sometimes it's important to know where your Federal Reserve District Bank is located. And when we talk about dealing with the Federal Reserve, as bankers deal with them, they're dealing with their local, or I guess regional is the way to look at it, district bank, and they're set up as 12 districts, sort of modeled along the lines of the federal judiciary, which has appellate circuits. It's self-funding, it receives no tax dollars, and therefore it's mostly autonomous. This is another reason why I think a lot of members of Congress have sort of picked on it for a number of years. The Federal Reserve receives no tax dollars whatsoever. It's self-funding. It earns its income through fees on member financial institutions, which are primarily banks. It also earns a lot of interest on the federal debt that it owns. And as you'll see when we talk about fiscal policy on Thursday, a lot of the national debt, which is the borrowing to support the government over time, because we tend to spend more than what we take in tax dollars, the Federal Reserve ends up buying a lot of that and receives the interest on that to self-fund. So it doesn't really need Congress to oversee it, and in fact, it's mostly autonomous. So it's managed by 7 members of the Board of Governors who are appointed by the president and are confirmed by the Senate. They serve a term of 14 years each. So the 7 members are staggered every 2 years. One person comes in, one person leaves. Theoretically, the reality is people don't usually stay 14 years. It's a long time. It's really that, and they can serve another part of someone else's term of 14 years. In fact, the last chairman we had, well, not the last one, but 3 chairmen back, Alan Greenspan, served as chairman for all 19 years because he served all of his 14 years and 5 of someone else's. And then he had to leave, his time was up. And as chairman, he has a 4-year role as chairman, but as a member of the board, it was a 14-year term. That could be renewed if you pick up someone else's term who's left early, and most leave early. So 14 years is a long time, but it was intended to be a long time, so they would outrun the presidencies and a lot of the tendencies of the elected side of the economy, frankly, to make them immune from the elected side so they can make decisions which might be unpopular. Raising interest rates is something that's probably not more popular. By the way, what would the fiscal policy need to do in order to achieve the same result? The government would need to raise taxes and cut government spending. That is exactly not what the government wants to do. President Biden has in recent days talked about raising taxes, but only on billionaires. That's maybe good politics, but there really aren't that many billionaires around. I mean, we have more than what we used to, but there just aren't that many. It's probably more politics in that regard because we simply can't tax everybody now. Probably, even though maybe we should. So that would be a quick reversal from all the stimulus that we just had. And I think it would be very confusing, frankly. And we're going to say that monetary policy is probably more effective in achieving this than fiscal policy. But that'll be sort of the concluding bit of content. So what else can we say about the Federal Reserve in terms of its structure? It's let me see here. So basically, there are the 12 district banks. We talked about that. There is a Federal Open Market Committee. So whenever you hear on the news, the Federal Reserve did this, the Federal Reserve did that, like 2 weeks ago when interest rates were raised, we're really talking about a body of the Federal Reserve called the Federal Open Market Committee that is composed of the 7 members of the Federal Reserve Board, plus 5 rotating members of the presidents of these district banks who serve 1-year terms and they rotate. There is a permanent member among those 5, and that's the New York Federal Reserve president, who's a permanent member. The other 4 rotate on and off on a yearly basis. Those 12 members then decide the direction of monetary policy, and none of them are elected by the public. The district bank presidents tend to be elected by bankers within their districts. But so really, there's no direct accountability to the public, which is one reason why we say that it's either a good thing or a bad thing, depending upon your point of view. I know that in our online classes, we usually have a discussion as to whether or not this is a good system to have our monetary and credit conditions controlled by people who really have no direct accountability. And in fact, will sometimes do things that are wildly unpopular and probably go too far. I think the evidence from the late 1970s, when we had a brand new Federal Reserve Chairman, Paul Volcker, was he absolutely put the brakes on the economy, probably a little bit too much in hindsight, but he got lots of praise for doing what the elected officials could not do, and that was squeeze out the inflation by basically slowing the economy down. And hitting the brakes is not what elected officials want to do for obvious reasons. So the Fed is also the brains and brawn of the nation's financial system. It's considered the nation's central bank. That is, it's the government bank. It's also, if you pull out dollars from your pocket, it'll say Federal Reserve note, and that is the Federal Reserve issues the currency. It can create currency, it can take currency away. So it is the issuer of currency. It's also the banker's bank. It serves as the bank to hold. If you make a bank deposit, it creates a reserve, remember? It's a liability for the bank, but it's also an asset because it creates a reserve, and those reserves are on deposit at the banker's bank, i.e. the Federal Reserve, that district bank that serves that particular area. It's also the government's bank, so if you get a tax refund check or any kind of government physical check, it'll say Federal Reserve, it won't say Treasury, it'll say Federal Reserve usually. It might say Treasury at the top, but it's drawn on the Federal Reserve. The account is at the Federal Reserve because the nation's checking account, so to speak, is at the Federal Reserve. It also serves as bank regulator. And this is a role that is probably minor, frankly. And I think the evidence for that is the fact that during the financial crisis that began in 2007, and went through 2008, et cetera, the Federal Reserve was probably not as active as what it should have been at trying to deal with really the source of some of the instability, which was some crazy mortgage lending. And remember, and if you think back about what the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 mandated, it was one of those was consumer protection. And Alan Greenspan, who was the Fed chairman throughout most of that time, has said, I told the class this, that in his autobiography, he sort of acknowledged the Fed really sort of fell down on its job as a regulator. By the way, the New York Fed president, that person who is a permanent member of that decision-making body, the FOMC, Federal Open Market Committee, a guy named Tim Geithner, back in 2008, was appointed by President Obama to be Treasury Secretary. And in his confirmation hearing, he said the Federal Reserve is really not a regulator. To which people said, really? You're not a regulator? That's the Fed president of New York who was saying they're not a regulator. It was a bit of a controversial statement, but it was probably an honest statement because regulation is not their main issue. They also do economic research. They provide guidance to Congress and the president. That's the brainy aspect. The brawn is they supply lots of coin and currency to banks. If you ever had a dollar bill, it's all bagged up, looks like it's been through the washer or whatnot. You take it to your bank and tell them we'll probably take that and put it in a stack of money that is eventually sent off to their cash area to be sent to the Federal Reserve to credit their account, and the money will just be destroyed, just be burned, it's destroyed. But when you need new money, they will ship it from the Federal Reserve to you, so they provide coin and cash. I don't know what this coin shortage is about that's been going on. I've never seen that happen before. I don't know what's happening there, but it's kind of weird and goofy, and I think it may be easing up now. I don't know if some of you have seen that, but I know that there are stores that would say, if you have change coming, we're only going to give you dollars. It's like, what? I mean, I don't even think that's illegal, is it, to deny somebody the change that they're due? But this real coin shortage has been something that's been unusual. So I think most people are now encouraged to pay with debit cards if you can, simply to avoid that particular policy. We also have traditionally maintained a nationwide system of check clearing. That's sort of now been modified with some of the electronic transactions, but some of that still goes to the Federal Reserve, as well as the wire payment system. So as a result, it kind of goes through them as well. Okay, all right. That's sort of a background as to what the Fed's about. Quick and dirty. Let's talk about monetary policy and what it's about. So monetary policy is defined as what? It's the supply, it's management of the supply of money and the availability of credit. And again, the actor is the Federal Reserve. So these two things, supply of money and the availability of credit. Remember, something we talked about before was this idea of liquidity. And it's the sort of the grease that runs the economy. It's the lubrication, in other words. We've probably, most of us have heard the term liquidity, and I've given this to you before, but liquidity basically equals money plus credit, right? Or I should say money. I'm not going to say cash. I'll just say money because it doesn't have to be, I don't want people to think it's only physical cash. It's money plus credit. That's what liquidity is. And so really what the Federal Reserve is trying to do is to manage liquidity. You can be very liquid because you've got a fair amount of cash on hand that you can use to pay expenses or unexpected bills or whatnot. But you can be also liquid by having availability of credit and the ability to borrow. And I think there's a lot of, I think people who financially do financial planning for individuals and businesses will oftentimes point to the need for people or the benefit to people to have some sort of borrowing capability available, a line of credit or something like that, in order to deal with an emergency, because they do come up. And they do come up in business, they do come up in even in government. So the ability to borrow is also an important aspect of it. The management of the price of that and everything else are the tools of monetary policy. Okay, so we got about 15 minutes left. I think it gives us enough time to talk about the tools of policy. And then what we'll get to is we'll give some of the graphing of that on Thursday. And then we'll move into fiscal policy. And what we don't get done there, we'll roll into the next week. And then before so we'll have a bit of maybe half an hour before we begin the discussion of exam 4. So I think we're in okay time frame here, really. Okay. So let's talk about the tools of monetary policy. There are considered to be three tools of monetary policy. Number one is the management of required reserves through a percentage of deposits known as the required reserve ratio, or sometimes called the triple R. And we talked a bit about that before. What it really is the percentage of bank deposits that banks must set aside on deposit in their reserves. They're called required reserves. They can't be loaned, they can't be invested. They're basically money in the economy that's not in play because it's sort of held in reserve. The original intent of that, back when they were first developed back in the 1860s, a long time ago, President Lincoln was president, was to assist banks during bank runs. That is, if everybody went to the bank and wants to get their money out, it really wouldn't be there because it's been loaned out, it's invested, it's not there. Your money is not there with your name on it. It's been gone. But these reserves were a cushion so that banks can at least draw upon those in emergency circumstances. Today, bank runs are mostly a thing of the past, knock on wood. And that reserves are really a way to control the money supply, and that's really the main role there. So we talk about that. That's the first of the tools of monetary policy. So let's do this. Let's sort of talk about what the tool itself is, and we will sort of describe that for everybody here, what direction of monetary policy we're going with here in order if the Federal Reserve is making a change in one of these tools. So the direction of monetary policy, right? And let me see here. The direction of monetary, the direction of the tool, right? The direction of the tool itself, okay, or the impact of the tool. The change in aggregate demand, right, which is going to be the impact on the economy. And then the final category here is the effectiveness. That is, how effective is each of these tools, okay? So I should say direction of the tool. Okay, direction of the tool. All right, so the first of these is the reserve ratio. Okay, which we define as the percentage of bank deposits the banks must set aside. So if the direction of monetary policy is to raise GDP in order to cover let's say a recessionary gap, then that's the direction. The tool then would be to lower the reserve ratio because it would take money that's not in play and put it in play in the economy in the hopes of raising aggregate demand. Okay, so that's the goal there. And it goes in the opposite direction. If the goal is to lower, which is what we're doing at the moment, is to lower GDP, the Fed might consider raising the reserve ratio. And by raising the reserve ratio, it slows down the economy because it slows down aggregate demand. Okay, and so that's the direction of monetary policy as relates to the required reserve ratio. Okay, and then we'll come to this, the last part that we'll talk about is the effectiveness of these, relatively speaking. Okay, what's the second tool? The second tool is management of what's called the discount rate. All right, we haven't talked about the discount rate at all, have we? The discount rate is the rate at which banks and other financial institutions can borrow money directly from the Federal Reserve. And it's basically a process where a bank makes an application to the Federal Reserve to borrow money. Usually they're fairly short term, like 30 days, something like that, but they can be extended, they can be renewed. And the discount rate is sort of symbolic in some ways. In fact, whenever the Fed makes a change to interest rates in general, it will usually change something called the Fed funds rate, which is not going to be one of these tools on here, but probably has greater importance, if for nothing else, than to signal to the rest of the economy the preferred direction of monetary policy. But usually what happens is they'll change both the rate for the Federal Reserve or that Fed funds, that bank-to-bank lending. They'll change that as well as the discount rate, which is Fed-to-bank lending. So the Fed funds, it's called the Fed funds window, just an overnight lending facility where banks borrow from each other, and that the rate on those, on the rate of interest is managed by the Fed, as is the discount rate, which is a different kind of loan to banks, but it's by the Federal Reserve itself. Okay, so as the discount rate, if the direction of policy is to raise GDP, that is to cover a recessionary gap, then the direction of the tool will be to lower that interest rate and in so doing to stimulate aggregate demand in order to achieve the direction of raising GDP. And if it's just the opposite, then we see if we're trying to bring down GDP, then we'll raise the interest rate, which should slow down aggregate demand. And the reasons why are if interest rates are higher, then those parts of the economy, those demand parts of the economy, which are interest sensitive, that is investment in all these capital goods, like remember I, C plus I plus G, all that is very interest sensitive, whether it's new construction, whether it's plant and equipment, whether it's inventories. If the rate of interest goes up, I tends to fall. But also a lot of some consumer items tend to be reactive to interest rates as well if rates are going up, such as auto financing, home equity loans, any kind of borrowing that consumers would do. There is some sensitivity to that. Autos are a big one because, if rates are going up, and increasingly with new cars in particular, the price of those are really, really high, and interest is a lot of the payment itself. And so if that rate goes up, that really brings the payment up for a lot of borrowers. Okay. So questions about those first two tools at this point. Okay, so let's move on to the third tool here. And the third tool is, excuse me, a little bit different because it's not as clear cut, and it's known as open market operations. Now, there is a committee, a standing committee at the Federal Reserve called the Federal Open Market Committee that basically decides all of these, the direction for policy of all these tools. Open market operations is simply defined as the active buying and selling of securities. And there's a reason why we went into such detail about the bond market. And that was not because I wanted to make this a finance class, but because when the Fed intervenes in the economy through open market operations, it generally is doing so in the bond market. Traditionally, it's been in the Treasury bond market, that is federal borrowings, federal debt. In recent years, the Federal Reserve has gotten itself involved in things like buying and selling mortgage debt, student loan debt, even credit card and car loan debt. So they have sort of stepped beyond their mandate, but still debt is in the form of bond. Okay, so that's essentially what how we define open market operations. So let's talk about this idea of intervening within markets. And so let's take the same methodology here and say, what if the Fed wants to raise GDP? Then what will it do in terms of direction of the tool? Well, it will be a net buyer of securities in the bond market. A net buyer. By net, I mean that it may be doing some selling, but it's doing more buying. And what's interesting too is if you ever talk to anybody who does work in the bond market, they'll know exactly when the Federal Reserve is doing something, either buying or selling, because they'll see immediate moves and big shifts in the prices of things, because the Fed basically has the capability of moving markets quickly and tremendously, simply because of its immense size and the fact that it can do something nobody else, and that's create money out of thin air, which we will talk a bit more about as we talk about money creation from the Federal Reserve standpoint. So by being a net buyer, here's what's going on, okay? By the way, it's also related to the interest rate mechanism as well, and that is this. Remember, we talked about this idea of the inverse relationship between bond yields and bond prices, that if yields are going up, which we call I sub C, and the price of bonds was going down, and if interest rates were going down, the bond prices were going up. And if you don't have that in your notes, go take a look at the video from, I think it was last Thursday, where I went into this. There's an inverse relationship between these two. So if the Fed is buying bonds, either buying, well, if anybody's a buyer more than a seller, we'll drive the price of that thing up, which will drive the interest rate down, which does what? Well, if the interest rate is going down, then that's going to have the effect of doing what? Raising aggregate demand, right? And bringing GDP up. And so that's how it accomplishes the goal of doing that. Even though it's not directly impacting the interest rate mechanism, it's doing so indirectly because of the fact that interest rates will be falling when the Fed is intervening. And you look, if you wonder why interest rates were so incredibly low for so many years, not just in the wake of the pandemic, but even in the years up to that, it's because the Federal Reserve was buying massive amounts of debt in the market. And again, they weren't restricting themselves only to government debt, but also to other kinds of debt, just because they want to have more tools at their disposal They're really trying to pump money into the economy in order to bring the economy up. That is, output and income up. Output, employment, income, all those good things up. So a net buyer will achieve that, and it will have the effect of raising aggregate demand if that's the goal. If the goal is the opposite condition, where the goal is to bring down GDP, which is really where we are now at the moment, the Fed will be a net seller. If somebody's dumping things on the market, selling, they'll drive the price of that thing down, and the interest rate will pop up. And so that's what's same thing going on here. If the interest rate goes up, it brings aggregate demand down, which achieves the goal of a lower GDP, which would be intended to close an inflationary gap. And this is probably, I think, well, I don't think probably, I think it's where we are at the moment. I think we are beyond full employment. We're operating beyond our capacity. And usually that doesn't sound like much of a problem, does it? It doesn't sound like a problem to be operating beyond full employment. It's almost saying someone's too healthy, or you're too good looking, or you have too much money, or you know, your house is too beautiful, right? I mean, all those kind of things. It sounds like that's not a problem to be. Why are we worried about that? Or why are we making a problem into something that's a good situation? Well, it's not a great situation because we're operating beyond full capacity, and so we need to slow it down. I mean, because the evidence, this is not the same metaphor as you know, being, you know, as what was Coco Chanel said, you can't be too rich or too thin. Well, that may be true, but that doesn't apply in economics. We can have too much of a good thing because it can be inflationary. It can be inflationary, and the evidence of that is all around us. We're about an 8% inflation rate on an annualized basis, which is many, many times higher than what it's been historically for the last, and I say historically, for the last 20 or so years. In fact, 40 years since we've even been close to this level of inflation. It's been 40 years. That's how successful monetary policy has been at controlling these conditions. But the pandemic, I think, threw a lot of things out of balance. We did have lots of stimulus to the economy from the fiscal policy side. Congress and the president, they were pumping a lot of cash into the economy. And we did have some supply kinks that probably kicked off the round of inflation, but now it's been sort of fuel on fire. The Federal Reserve is working now to try to break things down, slow it down. And again, the Federal Reserve will do it where the Congress and the president probably will not. Okay, probably will not. Which is why we say that, as a rule of thumb, I think it's safe to say the Federal Reserve's policy moves are generally more successful because they tend to be disassociated from political ramifications. Yeah, which is not to say that they don't know that they're being associated with that. I can recall a story where when Paul Volcker was the chairman of the Federal Reserve in the late 70s, it had been a particularly stressful time at the Federal Reserve, and they've been meeting day after day to try to deal with this wildly out of control inflation of those days, which was about 40-some years ago, right? And they also, let's go to dinner. And so they go to dinner and they're having drinks, they're laughing and yucking it up, and suddenly a member of Congress walked in, and Paul Volcker told everyone to cool it because a US senator walked in, and the next day they would raise interest rates dramatically. And they didn't like that look of yucking it up and the next day dropping the hammer on the economy, because it threw the economy into a big recession. It cured the inflation problem, but at the expense of lots of unemployment as a result. So the Fed might have overreacted, hit the brakes a little too hard. Okay. Now the final bit here, we've got about 2 or 3 minutes, is to talk about the relative effectiveness of these 3 tools. And so let's take these from top to bottom. How effective are these? How effective is the reserve ratio at trying to manage GDP through managing aggregate demand? And we're going to say it's not very effective. And there are a number of reasons why. Number one, the reserve ratio doesn't get changed very often. And if something doesn't get changed very often, then how can it be useful? And the initial purpose of the reserves in the first place was to prevent against bank insolvency if there were large withdrawals. Today, it's mostly as a monetary control measure. But I can tell you that changing the reserve ratio makes bankers' lives difficult. It drives them crazy because they have to recast their budgets because the reserve ratios have changed. They take in lots and lots of money in deposits. And if that reserve ratio changes, it sets their formula. Banking stability is an important goal. It's not that bankers get everything they want, but it's an issue of trying to maintain stability. So because it's not changed very much, and it's really not that effective, we're saying it's not very effective. What about the discount rate? We're going to say it's not very effective either. That it's mostly symbolic, and one of the reasons why is the fact, historically, borrowing from the Federal Reserve was considered an act of desperation, the lender of last resort. That is, you don't want to borrow from the Federal Reserve because it's a public event, it's public information when a bank does it. It signals that you're in trouble, and that's what banks do not want to communicate, is that the bank is in trouble. And so it's mostly symbolic. The Federal Reserve back in 2007, when the financial crisis was going, actually tried its best to try to change people's perception. That is, bankers' perceptions, what the discount window is all about. It's called the discount window, that's the facility. And actually it was encouraging banks to borrow from it. Come, borrow money from us, please do. They wanted to sort of change the stigma, but these old stigmas die hard. And so as a result, it's not very effective. It's mostly symbolic. In fact, if anything, in terms of rate mechanism, it's the Fed funds rate, which is more effective because it communicates directly the price of money that banks face immediately. And then it passed along to borrowers. So why isn't that on there? Well, the reason why is because it's not directly under the Fed's control. And it's not the Fed's money that's involved. It's banks' money. So it's related to this, but it's not a formal tool. Okay. We're not doing very well, are we? Not very. Well, let's hope this is better, and it is. And we're going to say this is very effective. It's very effective because it is very fast. And when I say fast, I mean it takes no longer than to simply enter buy and sell orders in a computer, and the transaction is done, and you've injected $100 million in the economy, or taken out $100 million, or whatever the dollar figure is. What's very interesting about this is the fact that during the financial crisis, and Ben Bernanke was the chairman of the Fed, that they were pumping lots and lots of money into the economy in order to deal with the recession brought about by banking collapse. And they were injecting, tremendous hundreds of billions of dollars. And 60 Minutes, he was on 60 Minutes, and they said, well, how did you do that? How did you create hundreds of billions of dollars out of thin air? And he just said, we just went into the computer and did it. That kind of tells you that now it'd be nice if we had that computer right in our house, but obviously we don't. That's why we have one area that does it. So open market operations is by far and away the preferred tool of monetary policy, even though it gets a lot less press than the interest rate mechanism. But by the way, as the Fed is doing this, as it's selling bonds, remember, it's bringing the price of bonds down and bringing the interest rate up. So it has the same effect as doing this, raising the rate and slowing down aggregate demand, which is really the goal here. Okay, so the only thing I have left to do is I'm going to do a little bit of graphing as to expansionary and contractionary monetary policy, and I'll try to set that up prior to class on Thursday so we can jump into that. It takes a lot of setup, frankly. It's a fairly busy set of graphs. And then we'll move into talking about fiscal policy, which is the other implement by which government tries to manage the economy. Okay, so questions for me about anything for those of you who are live on the link here? Okay, well, have a great day. I will see everybody on Thursday. Okay, bye-bye.